The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his pristine red uniform for what felt like the 100th time. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that perfection was not just expected, but demanded. Every button polished to mirror shine, every crease razor sharp, every movement calculated and precise. But today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. Marcus had been assigned to the Cambridge family detail for the past 5 years, ever since Prince Louis was born. He'd watched the youngest prince grow from a tiny bundle in his mother's arms to the spirited 4-year-old who now ran through the palace corridors with infectious laughter. Unlike his older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, Louis had a particular energy about him that reminded Marcus of his own son at that age. Curious, fearless, and wonderfully unaware of the weight of his royal birthright. The day began like any other. The Cambridge family was scheduled to attend a charity gala at the Grand Ballroom of Buckingham Palace. It was one of those formal events that required the children's attendance, much to young Louis's dismay. Marcus had noticed the boy's reluctance during the morning briefing, the way he fidgeted with his formal clothes, and looked longingly out the window at the garden where he'd rather be playing. As the family prepared to leave, Marcus took his position near the entrance, observing the familiar choreography of royal departure. The Duchess of Cambridge, elegant in her navy ensemble, was gently coaxing Louis into his miniature suit jacket while Prince William reviewed some last-minute documents with his private secretary. George and Charlotte, now seasoned veterans of such occasions, stood patiently by the door. "I don't want to go," Louis announced with a brutal honesty that only 4-year-olds possess. "It's boring, and I can't run there." Marcus suppressed a smile. In his years of service, he'd learned that the youngest members of the royal family often provided the most genuine moments in an otherwise carefully orchestrated existence. The Duchess knelt down to Louis's level, her voice soft and understanding. "I know it seems long, darling, but it's important work. We're helping children who don't have as much as we do," she explained, smoothing his hair with maternal tenderness. "And afterward, we'll have tea, and you can tell me all about your favorite parts." Louis considered this for a moment, his small face scrunched in concentration. Finally, he nodded, though his enthusiasm remained notably absent. Marcus made a mental note to keep extra attention on the young prince during the event. He'd learned to read the signs. Louis's compliance now might give way to restlessness later. The journey to Buckingham Palace was uneventful. Marcus rode in the security vehicle, maintaining constant communication with the advance team already at the venue. Through his earpiece, he received updates about the guest list, potential security concerns, and the evening's timeline. Standard protocol, but something nagged at him. Perhaps it was the way Louis had looked so small in that big car seat. Or maybe it was his own father's instincts recognizing a child being asked to be older than his years. Buckingham Palace buzzed with activity as they arrived. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards expected for such occasions. Marcus's team conducted their final security sweep while the family was briefed on the evening's proceedings. His role was clear: maintain close but unobtrusive protection, anticipate potential issues, and ensure the family's safety without interfering with their public duties. The grand ballroom was magnificent, as always. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across the ornate ceiling while hundreds of guests in evening were mingled over champagne and canapes. Marcus positioned himself strategically, able to observe the entire room while staying within quick response distance of the family. His trained eyes continuously scanned for anything unusual, a face that didn't belong, behavior that seemed off, exits that might be compromised. The Cambridge family entered to warm applause. Prince William and the Duchess moved gracefully through the crowd, their years of experience evident in how effortlessly they engaged with guests. George and Charlotte flanked their parents, polite smiles fixed in place, while Louis walked between them, his small hand gripping his father's jacket. Marcus noticed how Louis's eyes darted around the vast room, taking in the overwhelming sensory experience. The child had attended such events before, but never had Marcus seen him look quite so overwhelmed. The noise level was substantial, hundreds of conversations, clinking glasses, classical music from the string quartet in the corner. For an adult, it was energizing. For a 4-year-old, it must have felt like assault. The evening progressed through its planned stages. Cocktails were served while guests mingled and took photographs with the royal family. Marcus watched as Louis gamely posed for pictures, shaking hands with dignitaries who bent down to his level, answering questions about school, and his favorite activities with the rehearsed responses he'd been taught. But Marcus could see the signs building. Louis's smiles became more forced, his movements more restless. The child kept looking toward the exits, clearly calculating distances to freedom. His small hands fidgeted with everything within reach, his jacket buttons, his parents' clothing, the edge of the table when they were seated. During dinner, Marcus positioned himself near the royal table, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough to avoid interfering with the meal service. The seating arrangement had placed Louis between his mother and Princess Charlotte, with Prince William and Prince George across from them. It was meant to provide support and supervision, but Marcus could see it also made Louis feel trapped. The child had been well-behaved throughout the first course, though he barely touched his food. The second course brought a slight improvement. He seemed interested in the dessert presentation, but by the time the speeches began, Louis was clearly reaching his limit. Lord Pemberton, the charity's chairman, approached the podium for what Marcus knew would be a lengthy address about the organization's work and achievements. The room fell silent except for the occasional cough or rustle of fabric. In this sudden quiet, every sound seemed amplified. Louis lasted approximately 10 minutes into the speech before the inevitable happened. It started as a quiet whimper, the sound of a child who had been brave for as long as he possibly could. The Duchess immediately reached for his hand, whispering reassurances, but the damage was done. In the acoustics of the grand ballroom, even Louis's softest sounds carried. Marcus watched as several guests turned toward the royal table, their expressions ranging from understanding to mild irritation. He'd seen this before at other events, the delicate balance between a child's natural behavior and the expectations placed upon royal children. Usually, these moments passed quickly with minimal disruption, but tonight felt different. Perhaps it was Louis's accumulated exhaustion, or maybe the formal atmosphere felt more oppressive than usual. When the Duchess tried to comfort him, his quiet whimper escalated into genuine crying. Not tantrum crying. Marcus had enough experience with children to know the difference, but the overwhelmed, tired crying of a small boy who had been expected to be an adult for too long. The sound cut through the ballroom like a blade. Lord Pemberton paused mid-sentence. The string quartet faltered, and conversations stopped throughout the room. In that moment of suspended silence, Louis's distress seemed to echo off the ornate walls, and Marcus felt every parent in the room sympathize with the Cambridge family's predicament. Prince William immediately moved to comfort his son, lifting him gently and whispering reassurances. The Duchess gathered her purse, clearly preparing to step outside until Louis could compose himself. It was exactly the right response, dignified, caring, and minimally disruptive to the event. But before they could execute their graceful exit, something happened that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his career. Sir Reginald Ashworth, a prominent businessman and major donor to the charity, rose from his seat near the royal table. Marcus had noticed him earlier, mid-60s, expensively dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his opinions heard and respected. He'd been drinking steadily throughout the evening, though he didn't appear obviously intoxicated. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Ashworth announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "We're here for serious charitable work, not to listen to a spoiled child's tantrum." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus felt his entire body tense, his training warring with his parental instincts. Every security protocol told him to remain in position, to avoid creating additional scenes. But every fiber of his being as a father and as someone who had watched Louis grow wanted to step forward. Before anyone could respond, Ashworth continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Children this young have no business at events like this. If you can't control your child, perhaps you should reconsider bringing him to important functions." The Duchess's face went pale, though she maintained her composure. Prince William's jaw tightened visibly, but his training in diplomacy held him in check. Louis, still crying in his father's arms, seemed to sense the tension and cried harder. Then, Ashworth made the mistake that would define the rest of the evening. He reached out and struck Louis on the shoulder, not hard enough to physically injure, but firmly enough to shock and frighten the child. "Stop that noise immediately," he commanded, his face red with alcohol and indignation. The moment stretched like eternity. Marcus saw the action develop in slow motion, his mind processing the threat assessment and response protocols instantaneously. A civilian had made physical contact with a member of the royal family in an aggressive manner. Every alarm bell in his training was screaming. But more than that, Marcus saw something that transcended duty and protocol. He saw a frightened 4-year-old boy who had been struck by a stranger for the crime of being overwhelmed and tired. He saw Lewis's face crumple not just with continued tears, but with confusion and fear at this unprecedented aggression from an adult. In that crystalline moment of clarity, Marcus Thompson, the Royal Protection Officer, and Marcus Thompson, the father of a 4-year-old son, became the same person with the same priority. He moved. 23 years of training compressed into 3 swift steps that brought him between Ashworth and the royal family. His hand closed around Ashworth's wrist with enough force to ensure the man's complete attention. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent ballroom. "You will step away from the prince immediately." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that everything he'd worked for, every protocol he'd sworn to uphold, every carefully constructed barrier between emotion and duty had just been obliterated by the sound of a frightened child's cry and the sight of a stranger's hand raised against him. The consequences would come later. Right now, there was only this moment, this choice, this line that had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. Marcus Thompson, Royal Protection Officer, father, and guardian, stood his ground and waited to see what would happen next. The silence that followed Marcus's intervention was deafening. In the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of protocol had dictated every interaction, every gesture, every word, a Royal Protection Officer had just broken rank to defend child. The weight of that moment pressed down on everyone present like a physical force. Sir Reginald Ashworth stared at Marcus with shock and growing fury. His wrist remained trapped in Marcus's iron grip, and for the first time in decades, someone had dared to contradict him publicly. The alcohol in his system, combined with his wounded pride, created a dangerous cocktail of rage that Marcus could see building behind his eyes. "Release me immediately," Ashworth hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what you've just done?" Marcus didn't move. His training told him to assess the threat level, and everything about Ashworth's posture, his clenched free hand, his aggressive stance, suggested the danger wasn't over. More importantly, Lewis was still crying in his father's arms, still frightened and confused by what had just happened. "I know exactly who you are, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. "And I know exactly what I've done. You struck a child. That will not happen again." Prince William had stepped back slightly with Lewis, creating distance while the Duchess moved protectively closer to her other children. Marcus was acutely aware that every security camera in the ballroom was recording this interaction, that hundreds of witnesses were watching a Royal Protection Officer openly confront a prominent guest. His career was effectively over, but he found he didn't care. What he cared about was the way Lewis had flinched when Ashworth's hand came down on his shoulder. What he cared about was the look of betrayal in the child's eyes at being hurt by an adult he'd been taught to trust and respect. What he cared about was ensuring that no one else would feel entitled to lay hands on this boy again tonight. Lord Pemberton, still at the podium, seemed frozen in indecision. The evening's careful choreography had been shattered, and no one quite knew how to proceed. Several guests had risen from their seats, creating a growing circle of observers around the confrontation. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, their instruments hanging silent in their hands. "Marcus!" Prince William's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. "Thank you. I'll take it from here." It was both a recognition of Marcus's actions and a gentle command to step back. Marcus understood the delicate position the prince was in, grateful for the protection of his son, but needing to manage the diplomatic fallout that was already beginning to unfold. But before Marcus could respond, Ashworth made his second critical mistake of the evening. "This is outrageous," he declared, pulling free from Marcus's loosened grip and turning to address the room. "I've donated millions to various charities, I've served on countless boards, and I'm being manhandled by hired security for trying to teach a child basic manners." The words landed like physical blows on the gathered crowd. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he watched Ashworth play to the audience. trying to reframe his aggression toward a 4-year-old as reasonable discipline. That child, Ashworth continued, pointing an accusing finger toward Lewis, has been disrupting this entire event. Someone needed to take action since his parents clearly weren't going to. That was the moment everything changed. The Duchess of Cambridge, who had maintained perfect composure throughout her public life, who had weathered media storms and public scrutiny with grace and dignity, stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an authority that Marcus had rarely heard from her. "Sir Reginald," she said, her words cutting through the ballroom like crystal, "my son is 4 years old. He has been sitting quietly through a 3-hour adult event, has behaved impeccably during photographs and introductions, and was simply overwhelmed by the noise and stimulation. What he needed was comfort and understanding, not to be struck by a stranger." The formality of her address, using his full title rather than the casual conversation they'd shared earlier, sent a clear message to everyone present about how the situation had shifted. Prince William moved to stand beside his wife, Louis still in his arms, but calming slightly now that he was surrounded by his family's protective presence. Louis was not disrupting anyone, he said, his diplomatic training evident in his measured tone. He was being a normal 4-year-old child who had reached his limit of endurance for the evening. Your response was inappropriate and will not be tolerated. Marcus watched the dynamics play out with fascination and growing concern. The royal family was handling the situation with perfect diplomatic precision, but he could see that Ashworth was not backing down. If anything, the man seemed more agitated by being challenged by people he'd clearly expected to defer to his authority. Inappropriate. Ashworth's voice rose several octaves. "I'll tell you what's inappropriate. Bringing unsuitable children to adult events, and then allowing security personnel to assault guests when someone tries to maintain order." The word assault hung in the air like a threat. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the potential legal implications of what had just happened. He'd physically restrained a civilian, no matter how justified he felt the action had been. Ashworth could press charges, could claim injury, could turn this entire incident into a legal nightmare that would destroy not just Marcus's career, but potentially create a scandal for the royal family. But as these thoughts raced through his mind, something unexpected happened. The crowd, which had been largely silent observers to the confrontation, began to murmur among themselves. Marcus caught fragments of conversations. "Did you see what he did to that child? Absolutely disgraceful behavior. That poor little boy. Someone should have stepped in sooner." The tide of public opinion was shifting against Ashworth, and Marcus realized that the man's attempts to justify his actions were only making things worse. But that didn't necessarily improve Marcus's situation. He'd still broken protocol, still stepped outside his defined role, still created a public incident that would require explanation and consequences. Lady Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's wife and co-chair of the charity, stepped forward from the crowd. She was a woman in her 70s, with the kind of unshakable dignity that came from decades of charitable work and social leadership. "Reginald," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had known Ashworth for decades, "you've had too much to drink, and you've behaved abominably. I think it would be best if you left now, before you embarrass yourself further." The public rebuke from someone of Lady Pemberton's standing sent another ripple through the crowd. Marcus could see Ashworth calculating his options, his pride warring with his growing awareness that he was losing the battle for public sympathy. "I will not be dismissed like a common troublemaker," Ashworth declared, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "I demand an apology from this security guard for his unprovoked assault, and I expect the royal family to take appropriate disciplinary action." Marcus felt the moment crystallize around him. This was his crossroads, his moment of truth. He could apologize, could de-escalate the situation by accepting blame and removing himself from the equation. It would probably save his job, would certainly minimize the diplomatic complications for the royal family, would restore the evening's civilized veneer. But it would also validate Ashworth's actions. It would send a message that striking a child was acceptable as long as you had enough money and social standing. It would teach Louis that sometimes adults who hurt you get to demand apologies from the people who protect you. Marcus made his choice. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "I will not apologize for protecting Prince Louis from your aggression. What you did was wrong, and I would do exactly the same thing again under identical circumstances." The words settled over the crowd like a declaration of war. Marcus had just publicly refused to back down, had committed himself irrevocably to his position. There would be no diplomatic solution now, no face-saving compromise for anyone involved. Prince William stepped forward, Louis still in his arms, but watching the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes. "Marcus," he said quietly, "you understand the position this puts us all in." Marcus nodded. He understood perfectly. His actions, however, justified they felt to him personally, had created a crisis that the royal family would have to navigate. They couldn't publicly endorse his behavior without seeming to approve of security personnel taking independent action. They couldn't condemn him without appearing to side with someone who had struck their child. "I do understand, Your Highness," Marcus replied, "and I accept full responsibility for my actions and whatever consequences follow." But before Prince William could respond, something remarkable happened. Lady Pemberton began to applaud. It started as a slow, deliberate clapping that seemed to echo through the vast ballroom. Then, one by one, other guests joined in. Within moments, the sound swelled into sustained applause that filled the room. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The crowd, hundreds of Britain's social and charitable elite, were applauding him for defying protocol to protect a child. Ashworth's face went from red to purple as he realized how completely the evening had turned against him. "This is madness," he declared, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "You're all encouraging insubordination and assault." But no one was listening to him anymore. The applause continued, and Marcus saw something in Louis's face that would stay with him forever. The little boy had stopped crying and was watching the crowd with wonder, as if he was beginning to understand that all these people were showing approval for someone who had protected him. The moment stretched on, the applause becoming not just approval of Marcus's actions, but a collective rejection of Ashworth's behavior. It was democracy in action, social pressure applied with the power of unified opinion. When the applause finally died down, Lord Pemberton stepped forward with visible relief. The crisis had resolved itself in a way that preserved everyone's dignity except Ashworth's. "I think," Lord Pemberton said carefully, "that this evening has demonstrated the very best qualities of those who dedicate themselves to protecting others, particularly the most vulnerable among us. Perhaps we should let young Prince Louis retire for the evening and continue our celebration of the charity's important work." It was a masterful diplomatic solution. The focus was shifted away from the confrontation and back to the event's purpose, while subtly acknowledging that Marcus had been protecting someone vulnerable. Louis could leave with dignity, Ashworth could slink away in defeat, and the evening could continue. But as the crowd began to disperse and conversations resumed, Marcus knew that the real consequences were just beginning. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had made a choice that would define not just his career, but his entire relationship with duty, protocol, and the family he'd sworn to protect. As Prince William approached him, Louis now calm in his arms, Marcus prepared himself for whatever came next. He'd made his choice with his eyes wide open, and he was ready to face the consequences. The only question now was whether anyone else was ready for what those consequences might mean. The journey back to Kensington Palace was conducted in relative silence, but Marcus could feel the weight of unspoken conversations filling the royal vehicle ahead of his security car. Through his earpiece, he received terse updates about media inquiries that were already beginning to flood the palace press office. Word the evening's incident had somehow leaked before they'd even left Buckingham Palace, and Marcus knew that by morning his name and face would be splashed across every newspaper in Britain. As they pulled through the palace gates, Marcus caught sight of Louis through the rear window of the royal car. The little boy was asleep against his father's shoulder, exhausted by the evening's events. Something twisted in Marcus's chest at the sight, relief that the child was safe and peaceful, but also a growing realization of how dramatically this night had changed everything. Commander Patricia Hayes, head of Royal Protection, was waiting in the security office when Marcus arrived for what he knew would be a very difficult debriefing. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had risen through the ranks by being both exceptionally competent and uncompromisingly professional. Marcus had worked under her command for 8 years and had never seen her look quite so serious. "Sit down, Marcus," she said without preamble. Her voice carried none of its usual warmth. and Marcus knew he was now speaking to his commanding officer rather than his colleague and mentor. Marcus took the offered chair across from her desk, noting absently that she'd already prepared a substantial file of documents. The efficiency suggested she'd been expecting this conversation, which meant the incident had been even more serious than he'd initially realized. "I've just spent 45 minutes on the phone with the palace press secretary, the director of security, and the private secretary to their royal highnesses," Commander Hayes began, her tone carefully neutral. "Would you care to explain to me exactly what happened tonight?" Marcus had been preparing for this question during the entire drive back to the palace. He considered various ways to frame his actions, different approaches that might minimize the damage to his career and the complications for the royal family. But, sitting across from Commander Hayes, he found himself unable to do anything but tell the truth. Sir Reginald Ashworth struck Prince Louis for crying during the charity event. Marcus said simply, "I intervened to prevent further aggression toward the prince." Commander Hayes made a note in the file before responding. "According to witness statements, you physically restrained Mr. Ashworth and publicly confronted him in front of approximately 400 guests." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that this constitutes a significant breach of protocol?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I understand that my actions were outside normal procedures, yes." "Outside normal procedures," she repeated. And, for the first time that evening, Marcus detected a hint of something that might have been amusement in her voice. "Marcus, you just created an international incident. Mr. Ashworth is threatening to press charges for assault. The media is calling you everything from hero to a rogue agent. The palace is fielding calls from news organizations in 17 different countries." The scope of the situation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been focused on the immediate threat to Louis, then on the confrontation with Ashworth, but he hadn't fully processed how far the ripples would spread. In today's connected world, a video of the incident was probably already circulating on social media, being analyzed and debated by millions of strangers. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Commander Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully measured. "Technically, you assaulted a civilian. You broke ranks during a public event. You created a diplomatic incident with significant media ramifications. By every measure of our protocols and procedures, you should be dismissed immediately and possibly face criminal charges." Marcus felt his heart sink, though the confirmation of what he'd already known didn't come as a surprise. He'd made his choice with full awareness of the consequences, and he was prepared to accept them. However, Commander Hayes continued, and Marcus looked up sharply at the change in her tone. "The situation is considerably more complicated than that." She pulled out what appeared to be a tablet and turned it toward him. On the screen was a video clip that had clearly been recorded by one of the guests at the charity gala. The footage showed the entire incident from beginning to end. Ashworth's aggressive approach to Louis, the strike against the child's shoulder, and Marcus's immediate intervention. "This video was posted online approximately 20 minutes after you left Buckingham Palace," she explained. "It's been viewed over 2 million times in the past 3 hours. The comments are running about 97% in your favor." Marcus watched the footage with a strange sense of detachment. From this angle, he could see things he hadn't been aware of during the actual incident. The way Louis had tried to make himself smaller when Ashworth approached, the visible shock on the Duchess's face when her son was struck, the immediate protective circle that formed around the royal family when Marcus stepped forward. "Social media reaction has been overwhelmingly supportive," Commander Hayes continued. "The hashtag #ProtectPrinceLouis is trending worldwide. There are calls for Mr. Ashworth to be stripped of his honors and banned from future royal events. 3 different members of Parliament have issued statements praising your actions." The information was almost too much to process. Marcus had expected disgrace, dismissal, and possibly prosecution. Instead, it seemed like he'd accidentally become some sort of folk hero. "What does the family think?" he asked, because that was ultimately what mattered most to him. Commander Hayes smiled for the first time that evening. "Prince William asked me to convey his personal thanks for your protection of Prince Louis. The Duchess wanted you to know that Louis fell asleep, asking if Marcus the guard would still be there tomorrow to keep him safe." The words hit Marcus harder than any reprimand could have. The idea that Louis felt safer because of his actions, that the child was worried Marcus might not be there anymore, created an emotional response he hadn't expected. However, Commander Hayes's tone became serious again. "We still have significant procedural issues to address. You can't simply take independent action during public events, no matter how justified you feel it might be. We have chains of command, established protocols, legal frameworks that exist for very good reasons." Marcus nodded his understanding. The protection of the royal family required split-second decision-making, but it also required predictability, coordination, and adherence to established procedures. His actions, however well-intentioned, had demonstrated that he was willing to abandon protocol when his personal judgment conflicted with established procedures. "What are my options?" he asked. Commander Hayes pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the palace. "The palace legal office has been reviewing the situation all evening. Mr. Ashworth's threat to press charges for assault is complicated by the fact that he initiated physical contact with a minor member of the royal family. His lawyers are apparently advising him that pursuing the matter might expose him to more serious legal consequences than he's prepared to face." That was a relief, at least. Marcus had been prepared to face criminal charges if necessary, but the practical implications for his family would have been devastating. "As for your employment," Commander Hayes continued, "we're facing an unprecedented situation. Normally, your actions would result in immediate dismissal. However, the public response has been so overwhelmingly positive that terminating your employment might create an even larger public relations crisis than keeping you on." Marcus could see the complexity of the situation from the palace's perspective. Fire him, and they'd appear to be punishing someone for protecting a child. Keep him, and they'd be seen as endorsing security personnel taking independent action during public events. "What they're proposing," she said, sliding the document across to him, "is a formal reprimand for breach of protocol, combined with additional training on crowd control and de-escalation techniques. You'll be temporarily reassigned from close protection duties while you complete the training program." Marcus read through the document carefully. It was essentially a face-saving measure for everyone involved. He'd be disciplined enough to satisfy procedural requirements, but not so severely as to suggest his actions were wrong. The temporary reassignment would remove him from the immediate spotlight, while allowing the situation to cool down. "There's one more thing," Commander Hayes said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "This offer comes with the personal endorsement of their Royal Highnesses. Prince William specifically requested that you be given the opportunity to continue serving the family in some capacity." The generosity of the gesture overwhelmed Marcus. After he'd potentially embarrassed them publicly, after he'd created a diplomatic incident that would require careful management for months to come, the royal family was still advocating for his continued employment. "I'm grateful for their faith in me," Marcus said quietly. "But I need to ask, do they understand that I would do exactly the same thing again if faced with the same situation?" Commander Hayes studied him for a long moment. "I believe they're counting on it," she said finally. "Marcus, what happened tonight was a crisis that revealed something important about character. When protocol conflicted with protecting a child, you chose to protect the child. That's exactly the kind of person they want protecting their family." The weight of the evening was finally catching up with Marcus. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation and its immediate aftermath was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange sense of anticlimax. He'd prepared himself for career-ending consequences, but instead found himself being offered a path forward that preserved both his employment and his principles. "There is one condition," Commander Hayes added, and Marcus tensed again. "The palace wants your assurance that in future situations, you'll attempt to work within established protocols whenever possible. They understand that split-second decisions sometimes require independent action, but they'd prefer that such actions be the exception rather than the rule." Marcus considered this carefully. He could live with attempting to work within protocols, as long as the ultimate priority remained the safety and well-being of the family he'd sworn to protect. "I can agree to that," he said finally. Commander Hayes smiled and extended her hand across the desk. "Then, welcome to your new assignment, Sergeant Thompson. Report to training on Monday morning, and try to stay out of the newspapers between now and then." As Marcus shook her hand, he realized that the evening had changed more than just his career trajectory. He'd discovered something about himself, about the line between duty and conscience, about what happened when those two forces aligned rather than conflicted. Walking out of the security office into the quiet palace corridors, Marcus thought about Lewis sleeping peacefully upstairs, safe in his bed, and protected by people who had chosen to put his welfare above their own careers. It seemed like a good foundation for whatever came next. 3 weeks after the Charity Gala incident, Marcus Thompson found himself in an entirely different world than the one he'd known for over 2 decades. The training facility at Hendon was familiar territory. He'd completed his initial royal protection training here 23 years ago, but returning as someone whose name was internationally recognized felt surreal. The media attention had been relentless. Every major newspaper in Britain had run features about the guard who broke protocol, with opinions ranging from breathless hero worship to stern criticisms of his breach of established procedures. International coverage had been even more intense, with American talk shows debating the balance between duty and moral imperative, and European papers analyzing the incident as a window into modern British values. Marcus had declined all interview requests, following palace guidance about maintaining professional discretion. But the silence hadn't stopped the speculation. Social media had created an entire mythology around the incident, with hashtags like #MarcusTheGuardian and #ProtectTheProtector generating millions of posts. Someone had even started a petition calling for him to receive official recognition for his actions, which had garnered over 800,000 signatures. The strangest part was how the incident had affected his personal life. His wife Sarah had initially been supportive, but worried about the potential consequences for their family. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma had become something of a celebrity at school, with classmates wanting to know if her father was really the guard who had protected Prince Louis. Sarah's parents, who had always been mildly disapproving of Marcus's career choice, were now telling everyone they met about their son-in-law's heroic actions. But it was the letters that had affected Marcus most deeply. Hundreds of them arrived at the palace daily, forwarded to him through official channels. Parents writing to thank him for showing their children that adults should protect kids, not hurt them. Teachers using the incident as a discussion point about standing up for what's right. Child protection advocates praising him for demonstrating that a child's welfare should always come first, regardless of social status or formal protocols. One letter in particular had moved him to tears. It was from a 7-year-old girl whose teacher had read her a news article about the incident. In careful, childish handwriting, she'd written, "Dear Mr. Guard, thank you for helping the little prince. My daddy hits me sometimes, and no one stops him. Maybe someone like you will help me too someday." The letter had been forwarded to appropriate child protection services, but it crystallized for Marcus exactly why his actions had resonated so strongly with the public. It wasn't just about protecting one privileged child. It was about establishing the principle that all children deserve protection from adult aggression, regardless of the circumstances. The training program he'd been assigned to was officially called Advanced Crowd Management and De-Escalation Techniques, but everyone involved understood it was really about finding ways to handle similar situations within established protocols. His instructor, Chief Inspector Helen Morrison, was a veteran of both police work and royal protection who had been specifically chosen for her ability to balance rule following with practical reality. "The challenge," she explained during one of their sessions, "is that your instincts were absolutely correct, but your methods created problems that could have been avoided with different techniques." They worked through dozens of scenarios, practicing ways to de-escalate situations, coordinate with other security personnel, and protect family members while minimizing public disruption. Marcus found the training genuinely useful, even as he privately maintained that no amount of technique would have changed his fundamental response to seeing Louis being struck. The most difficult aspect of his temporary reassignment was the distance it created from the family he'd grown to care about deeply. For 5 years, he'd been part of the Cambridge household's daily rhythm. He'd watched the children grow, had shared quiet moments with them during long travel days, had become invested in their lives in ways that went far beyond professional obligation. Louis, in particular, had been asking about him constantly, according to updates Marcus received through Commander Hayes. The little boy didn't fully understand why Marcus the guard wasn't around anymore, and his parents were struggling to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms. 2 weeks into his training program, Marcus received an unexpected summons to Kensington Palace. The message came through official channels, requesting his presence for a meeting with their Royal Highnesses. His first thought was that something had gone wrong. Perhaps public opinion had shifted or new complications had arisen from the incident. He arrived at the palace with considerable anxiety, unsure whether he was being called to receive additional discipline or some other consequence he hadn't anticipated. The familiar corridors felt different somehow, as if his changed status had altered his relationship with the space itself. Prince William and the Duchess receive him in the same sitting room where he'd attended countless security briefings over the years. But the atmosphere was entirely different from those professional meetings. Louis was there too, playing quietly with toy cars in the corner, and Marcus felt his heart skip when the boy looked up and smiled with genuine delight. "Marcus!" Louis exclaimed, abandoning his toys to run over. "Mummy said you were doing special guard training. Are you learning new ways to keep people safe?" The directness of the question, and the complete absence of any awareness of the controversy his protection had created, reminded Marcus of why he'd acted as he had. To Louis, the situation was simple. A bad man had hurt him. Marcus had made the bad man stop, and now Marcus was learning to be an even better protector. "Something like that," Marcus replied, kneeling down to Louis's level. "How have you been, Your Highness?" "Good," Louis said matter-of-factly. "But I missed having you around. Daddy said you had to go away for a little while because you helped me, and that some grown-ups thought that was wrong even though it was right." The explanation was perfect in its simplicity, and Marcus realized that Prince William had managed to convey the essential truth of the situation in terms a 4-year-old could understand. Sometimes doing the right thing gets you in trouble with people who don't understand. "Would you like to see my new drawing?" Louis asked, already pulling Marcus toward a table covered with art supplies. "I made a picture of you stopping the mean man." The drawing was typical 4-year-old artwork. Stick figures in primary colors with enthusiastic but imprecise details. But the story it told was unmistakable. A tall figure in red standing between a smaller figure and a threatening darker shape. It was titled, in the Duchess's careful handwriting, "Marcus Keeps Me Safe." "It's wonderful," Marcus said honestly. "Would you mind if I kept it?" Louis nodded vigorously. "Mummy said you might like it. She said you probably don't get to see many pictures of yourself being a hero." The adults exchanged glances over the boy's head, and Marcus could see the complicated emotions in the royal couple's faces. Pride in their son's resilience, gratitude for Marcus's protection, but also awareness of the broader implications of the incident and its aftermath. "Louis," the Duchess said gently, "why don't you go find Charlotte and see if she wants to play in the garden? Marcus needs to talk to Daddy and me about grown-up things." Louis nodded and gave Marcus an impulsive hug before running off to find his sister. The casual affection in the gesture struck Marcus powerfully. To this child, he wasn't a security risk or a protocol violation or a media sensation. He was simply Marcus, the person who had kept him safe when someone tried to hurt him. Once Louis had left, the atmosphere in the room shifted back to the more formal dynamic Marcus was accustomed to. Prince William gestured for him to sit, and the Duchess poured tea with the automatic grace that came from years of managing countless such meetings. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," Prince William began. "We want to speak with you personally about several things that have developed since the incident." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, unsure whether this was leading toward good news or bad. "First," the prince continued, "we want you to know how grateful we are, not just for your protection of Louis, but for how you've handled the aftermath. The media attention has been intense, and your discretion in not giving interviews or making public statements has been exemplary." That was a relief, at least. Marcus had been following palace guidance, but he'd worried that his silence might be misinterpreted as either guilt or arrogance. "Second," the Duchess added, "we're aware of the public response to the incident, and we want you to know that it's been overwhelmingly positive. The letters, the social media support, the petition calling for you to receive recognition, all of it has been remarkable." Marcus nodded, still unsure where this conversation was heading. "Which brings us to the third point," Prince William said, his tone becoming more serious. "We've been approached by several organizations who would like to work with you in some capacity. Child protection charities, anti-bullying campaigns, groups focused on bystander intervention training. Your actions have apparently inspired a broader conversation about adult responsibility to protect children." The idea of becoming some sort of public advocate hadn't occurred to Marcus. His focus had been entirely on completing his training program and hopefully returning to his protection duties. The thought of leveraging the incident for broader social impact was both appealing and intimidating. "What kind of involvement would that mean?" he asked. "That would be entirely up to you," the Duchess replied. "But the opportunities range from occasional speaking engagements to more formal partnerships with established organizations. The palace would support whatever level of involvement you're comfortable with." Marcus considered this carefully. The idea of using his unexpected platform to help protect other children was appealing, but he was also aware that any public role would come with complications and responsibilities he'd never had to consider before. "There's one more thing," Prince William added, and something in his tone suggested this was the most important part of the conversation. "When you complete your training program, we'd like you to return to close protection duties with our family. Not because the incident has been forgotten or forgiven. It doesn't need forgiveness, but because Lewis has been asking for you constantly, and because we believe you're exactly the kind of person who should be protecting our children." The offer hit Marcus with unexpected force. After weeks of uncertainty about his future, the clear statement that he was not just welcome back, but actively wanted felt like vindication of his choices. "Lewis has been having some difficulty sleeping," the Duchess explained quietly. "He's been asking about whether Marcus will be there if someone tries to hurt him again. We've tried to reassure him, but I think he needs to see that you're still part of his protection team." The revelation that his actions had created anxiety for Lewis was painful for Marcus. He protected the boy from immediate harm, but the broader consequences had apparently created new fears and insecurities. "Of course," Marcus said without hesitation. "I'd be honored to continue serving the family." Prince William smiled, and for the first time since the incident, Marcus felt like the ground was solid beneath his feet again. The training would continue, the media attention would eventually fade, and he would return to the job he'd chosen 2 decades ago for all the right reasons. As the meeting concluded and Marcus prepared to leave, the Duchess handed him an envelope. "This arrived yesterday," she said simply. "We thought you should see it." Inside was a letter from Sir Reginald Ashworth's solicitors, formally withdrawing any threat of legal action and acknowledging that their client's behavior at the charity gala had been inappropriate. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was recognition that pursuing the matter would only bring more negative attention to actions that had already been widely condemned. Walking back through the palace corridors toward the exit, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 weeks. He'd gone from anonymous protection officer to reluctant public figure, from rule follower to symbol of moral courage, from someone whose job was to fade into the background to someone whose actions had sparked international debate. But at the core of it all was something simple and unchanging: a 4-year-old boy who needed protection, and adults who were willing to provide it. Everything else was just details. 6 months after the charity gala incident, Marcus Thompson stood once again in his familiar position outside the Cambridge family's private quarters at Kensington Palace. The red uniform felt the same. His posture was as precise as ever, and the security protocols he followed were largely unchanged. But everything else about his role had been fundamentally transformed. The training program at Hendon had been completed successfully, with Marcus earning commendations for his grasp of advanced de-escalation techniques and crowd management strategies. More importantly, he learned to integrate his protective instincts with enhanced communication skills and situational awareness that could help prevent confrontations before they escalated to physical intervention. But the real change wasn't in his professional capabilities. It was in how the world viewed him and how he'd come to understand his own role within the larger framework of child protection and public service. The speaking engagements had started small. A local school had invited him to talk to children about staying safe and trusting adults who protect them. The headmistress had been nervous about the publicity, but the children's response had been overwhelmingly positive. They asked simple, direct questions about how to know which adults were safe, what to do when someone bigger tried to hurt them, and whether they could count on grown-ups to help them when they needed it. From that first engagement, word had spread. Teachers' organizations wanted him to address the importance of adult intervention in bullying situations. Child protection charities asked him to speak about bystander responsibility. Parent groups requested guidance on teaching children about appropriate adult behavior and when to seek help. The requests had multiplied until Marcus found himself with a secondary career as an advocate for child protection and bystander intervention. The palace had been supportive, allowing him to take limited time for speaking engagements as long as they didn't interfere with his primary duties and aligned with royal family values. The most meaningful invitation had come from a national society for the prevention of cruelty to children. They'd asked him to serve as an ambassador for their campaign against child abuse, specifically focusing on encouraging adult bystanders to take action when they witnessed children being mistreated. Your story demonstrates that protecting children isn't just the responsibility of parents or teachers or social workers. The NSBCC director had explained during their initial meeting. It's the responsibility of every adult who encounters a child in distress. Marcus had accepted the role, understanding that his unique platform came with both opportunities and obligations. The charity work had introduced him to stories of children whose experiences made Prince Louis's brief encounter with aggression seem minor by comparison. But it had also shown him how his actions had inspired other adults to speak up, step in, and prioritize child welfare over social convenience. The media attention had gradually shifted from sensationalizing the original incident to focusing on the broader movement it had helped inspire. The Marcus effect had become a recognized phenomenon in child protection circles, the increased willingness of bystanders to intervene when they witnessed children being mistreated. Studies conducted by university researchers had documented a measurable increase in calls to child protection hotlines, reports of witnessed abuse, and adult interventions in public situations involving children. The data suggested that Marcus's very public decision to prioritize a child's welfare over protocol had given permission to countless other adults to trust their protective instincts. But the most important measure of success, from Marcus's perspective, was much simpler. Prince Louis no longer had nightmares about being hurt by strangers. The little boy had initially struggled with anxiety following the charity gala incident. He'd become clingy with his parents, reluctant to attend public events, and worried about whether Marcus would be there to protect him if needed. The family had worked with child psychologists to help him process the experience, but ultimately, the most effective therapy had been Marcus's return to active duty. It's remarkable, the child psychologist had explained to Marcus during one of their consultations. Children are incredibly resilient, but they need to see that the adults in their lives are capable of protecting them. Your presence provides him with a sense of security that no amount of talking could achieve. Now, 6 months later, Louis was back to his energetic, curious self. He still occasionally asked about the mean man at the party, but without the fear that had characterized his earlier questions. More importantly, he developed a sophisticated understanding of adult behavior that was remarkable for a 4-year-old. Some grown-ups are good, and some are bad, he'd explained to his younger cousin during a family gathering that Marcus had overheard. But the good ones always try to stop the bad ones from hurting children. Marcus is one of the really good ones. The simple faith in that statement had moved Marcus more than any public accolade or professional recognition could have. The royal family's response to his expanded public role had been entirely supportive. Prince William and the Duchess had both attended several of his speaking events, lending their presence to causes they believed in while demonstrating their continued confidence in his judgment and character. "What you've done," the Duchess had told him after a particularly moving presentation to a conference of social workers, "is show people that protecting children isn't just about following rules or procedures. It's about recognizing that every child deserves to feel safe, and every adult has some responsibility for making that happen." The international response had been equally significant. Marcus had received invitations to speak at conferences in 12 different countries, with child protection organizations worldwide citing his actions as an example of effective bystander intervention. Several European nations had incorporated his story into their public awareness campaigns about child abuse prevention. The most unexpected development had been the academic interest in his case. Criminology departments, social work schools, and psychology programs had begun using the charity gala incident as a case study in moral decision-making, professional ethics, and the psychology of bystander intervention. A professor from Cambridge University had interviewed Marcus extensively for a research paper on the intersection of professional duty and moral imperative in high-stakes situations. The resulting publication had been cited in dozens of subsequent studies and had helped establish new frameworks for training professionals who work with vulnerable populations. "Your case is fascinating," the professor had explained, "because it demonstrates how individual moral courage can create systemic change. Your decision to prioritize child protection over protocol didn't just help one child. It sparked a global conversation about adult responsibility toward all children." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Sir Reginald Ashworth had contacted the palace 6 months after the incident, requesting a private meeting with Marcus. The meeting had been arranged in a neutral location, with palace legal counsel present to ensure everyone's interests were protected. Ashworth had aged noticeably since the charity gala, and his demeanor was entirely different from the aggressive confidence he displayed that night. "I've spent considerable time reflecting on my behavior that evening," Ashworth had said, his voice quiet and serious. "I was drunk, stressed about business matters, and frustrated by what I perceived as disruption to an important event. None of those factors excuse what I did." Marcus had listened without comment, unsure where the conversation was leading. "I struck a 4-year-old child," Ashworth continued, and then attempted to justify that action when challenged. "I've had 6 months to think about what that says about my character, and I don't like the conclusions I've reached." The admission was more honest than Marcus had expected, and he found himself reassessing his opinion of the man who had created the crisis that changed his life. "I've made substantial donations to several child protection charities," Ashworth added. "It doesn't undo what I did, but it's a start toward making amends. I also wanted to tell you personally that your actions that night were exactly right. I was wrong, you were right, and I'm grateful that someone was there to protect that child from my inexcusable behavior." The apology had been genuine and complete, without excuses or attempts to minimize his actions. It had also marked a form of closure for Marcus, confirming that his instincts about the situation had been correct and that his intervention had been both necessary and appropriate. Now, standing in the familiar corridors of Kensington Palace, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed while remaining essentially the same. He was still a royal protection officer, still responsible for the safety and security of the Cambridge family, still bound by the same protocols and procedures that had governed his career for over 2 decades. But he was also something more, a symbol of the principle that protecting children supersedes all other considerations, a voice for the idea that moral courage sometimes requires breaking rules, and a reminder that every adult has some responsibility for the welfare of every child they encounter. Lewis appeared around the corner, running at full speed toward the garden with Princess Charlotte in pursuit. As he passed Marcus, the little boy paused just long enough to flash a brilliant smile and call out, "Hi, Marcus. I'm going to catch Charlotte." The casual confidence in his voice, the complete absence of fear or anxiety, the simple trust that his world was safe and protected, those were the measures by which Marcus evaluated the success of his choices that night 6 months ago. Everything else was just details. As the children's laughter echoed through the corridors, Marcus resumed his position and continued his watch, knowing that sometimes the most important duty is the willingness to abandon duty when something more fundamental is at stake. The red uniform remained the same, but the man wearing it had been forever changed by a moment when protecting a child had mattered more than following rules. In the end, that was the only measurement that truly mattered. A 4-year-old boy who could run and play and laugh without fear, secure in the knowledge that the adults around him would keep him safe. Everything Marcus had risked, everything he had gained, everything he had become, it all came down to that simple truth. Some things are more important than protocol. Some duties transcend orders. And sometimes, the most professional thing you can do is remember that you're human first.